My name is Jim Gears. I work for Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities, and it is a great pleasure and honor to be able to talk to you today about service animals. As James kind of said, I've been doing training on ADA issues for about 15 years with Opportunities for Ohioans with Disabilities. I actually need to correct my bio because it's 23 years in one day as of today, because James and I both started with Opportunities Collins on the same day 23 years ago. So we've got some experience between the two of us. The other thing I do have a trade is that the mind can only absorb what the behind can endure. I actually said that wrong. It was like the endurance of the mind is the top behind. So if you need to get up, move around, things like that, we're here till 3 o'clock. My goal is really to get you all the information that you need. I do want to make this as interactive as possible. Get out with some questions, and we're going to have some breakout sessions. There's 4 breakout sessions, and you should have each gotten an email from the folks who organized the presentation. And how that works is it's a separate invitation to another Teams meeting. So you'll go into that Teams meeting. It'll place this one on hold. We'll break for a set amount of time, and then we'll kind of come back and kind of have some discussion, just because so you can see what the other folks had talked about as far as what service animals and how they would address certain circumstances. I think that that's probably the most important thing that you get out of this, is not only what this information is, but how do you actually apply it to situations that might come up in your workplace. I know that we all have a lot of different job duties and job tasks throughout the state. I was kind of looking at what agencies were represented today. We have people from BWC, we have people from College Advantage. I saw somebody signed up from them, EPA, and some other folks, and even a college that are participating in the session today. All of you are going to have unique situations that come up regarding service animals in your workplaces, depending on what kind of service or program you're offering for those people. So there's not this one size fits all kind of situation that's going to apply for everybody. But I thought we would kind of start on the presentation today with actually a test. I don't know about folks, but I have 2 teenage kids, and since coronavirus, my part-time job is a school teacher. So I thought, I'll create a little test here to see what we know about it, and hopefully our pre-tests and our post-test, we're going to show some improvement in our learning here. I'm just going to have how we're going to do this. I'm just going to have people kind of chat in the box whether you think this would fall within the service animal definition or an emotional support animal definition. And we'll just kind of get some basic feedback from that. So the first slide, if you haven't got the slides, I'm going to give a description of the slides just to make sure that we have everybody on the same page. The first pre-test question, it shows a picture of this dog, and it's sitting in this lady's purse, and it's kind of peeking out with its nose and its eyes out there. Now, how many of you feel that this would meet the definition of a service animal? If someone came to you and said, this is my service animal, looking at that, do you think it would be, or do you think it would not be a service animal? If you go ahead and
I would say,
go ahead.
I was going to say, I would say first impression it wouldn't be, but it depends on what it's trained for. If it's trained as, say, a diabetes dog, they're not trained for CNI or anything like that. They're trained for sense to smell the air. So it depends on what it might be trained for. At first response, you would think no, because it's not a CNI dog or something like that. But until you know the actual reason, you don't know for sure.
Okay, that is a great answer, and that's what we kind of want to look at. Next example here, this one's a little bit easier. This is kind of like the free question you get on all the tests. It's a picture of a dog, and it has a red vest on it that actually says service dog. So hopefully everybody's going to say, yeah, this one probably, if someone came in and said, this is my service dog, you could kind of say that, yes, this is going to be a service animal. Next one is a picture of a miniature horse. So how many of you feel that a miniature horse would qualify as a service animal? There again, if you just want to go ahead and type in the chat box, whether you say yes, you think that it meets the definition or could be a service animal, or no. Okay, so seeing a lot of yeses. Okay, all right. And we'll kind of talk about what that might entail. The next one, the pretest question, is a picture of a albino Burmese python, ball python. How many of you feel that this would qualify as a service animal? Okay, starting to see some yeses come in on that. One no, a couple no's. All right, got a mixed one on that. All right, and the last question we have is last picture we have is of a small monkey. How many of you feel that this would be a service animal or would not? Okay, looks like we're getting some yeses and some nos on this one as well, which is good because that gives us something to kind of talk about during the presentation. All right, the next slide that we have here is talking about, we're going to go through the titles of the ADA. So we're going to look at Title I, Employment First scenarios. As all employers are required to make reasonable accommodations to allow an individual to perform the essential functions of their jobs, it's important to understand how service animals can actually meet that criteria or help someone do that. Now, it is important to understand that the essential functions of the job are still defined by the employer themselves. So, a good way of determining whether that essential function of the job is looking at a position description, determining how often someone might have to do a particular task, how critical it is to the job if it's not done, even if it's something that's not done very often, but if it's something that the job is really critical or depending on that particular task, then it could be an essential function of the job. And then the other thing is to really understand that when we talk about service animals in Title I, service animals really are a reasonable accommodation. So the process that's used to determine whether someone brings in a service animal to the workplace is the same that you would do if someone needed adaptive technology, say they needed a screen reader, or they needed some accessible parking, or they needed to be able to get into a restroom, so it had to be physically accessible. A service animal is in the same level as all of those things. So you would use the same criteria for that to determine whether the accommodation, what they're asking the accommodation for, and whether that service animal can fulfill that need for that individual. Now, when we look at Title II for public services, it gets a little bit more nebulous because Title II uses a different definition. They're looking at what is a reasonable modification of a policy or a procedure that allows someone to access a public service. So it's not as a high level as a reasonable modification. Reasonable accommodation. So the reasonable modification could be something different depending on what the person is doing. Typically, what you're going to have experience is that somebody's going to come into your office with a service animal. And what's important to know is how you're going to greet that person, what kind of questions you can ask as far as what that service animal is doing and things like that. It was somebody kind of mentioned that before when we were looking at the pictures. That's very good because those are all things that we're looking at as part of this process. The other thing is just making sure that if someone does bring a service animal, that's protected activity under the ADA. So under Title V, where it talks about You're not allowed to discriminate or retaliate or do anything that could be construed as a negative consequence as part of someone bringing a service animal in. To give you an example of that, there was a Title III case. An individual was bringing a service animal into a hotel setting, and the front desk clerk greeted them, and they said, well, this is a service animal. Well, we don't allow pets in there. The person still had to kind of explain what a service animal to them. It was related to their ability, their mobility. So it was providing them some stability when they were walking like that. Um, Eventually, the hotel clerk did allow them to bring their service dog into the hotel. But as a condition of doing that, he said, well, you can only go in through the back door. You can't come in through the front of the lobby. We don't want any other guests to see that this dog is in the hotel and things like that. So the person actually filed a complaint based on that, saying that they were treated unfavorably because of their service animal. There was a requirement that they were coming back through the back door through the service entrance. They filed a complaint, and the Department of Justice did go out and kind of cite the hotel for a violation, and the hotel had to do some education of their front desk staff on what to do when someone brings a service animal in. So a lot of times we have state agencies that have ADA coordinators assigned to them. You're very knowledgeable in everything that's ADA, or know where you can go to get some answers for that. But it's very critical to make sure that we're also training our frontline staff who might come in contact with someone before you do. Typically, you might be called in once there's a problem. But if you do training with your staff to say, okay, these are service animals. This is what somebody is allowed to do. This is what you can do as far as asking questions about the service animal and things like that. All right, so going back to some of our pictures that we kind of talked about, there were some changes in the American with Disabilities Amendments Act that went into effect. There was clarification that a service animal actually has to be a dog now. Prior to that update, people were allowed to have different types of animals for service animals. So like the state of Georgia did allow to have people to have monkeys as a service animal prior to the Amendments Act. So there's a lot of people who still think that, I can just have any kind of an animal as a service animal. They just might not be aware of the changes, even though it's been roughly 10 years since that has changed. People still don't understand that. So at this point in time, the Department of Justice is defining it for Title II and Title III as it must be a dog. The other thing is that it must be trained to do something. It was really nice when people were talking about whether those pictures would be a service animal or not. Somebody was kind of saying, well, it could be, depending on what it was trained to do or what function it was performing for that person. So that's a very critical component to that. And then it also has to be able trained to do something for the benefit of the individual for a disability. So it's doing something that the person with the disability would have a challenge doing on their own. We're starting to get a little bit of feedback. I don't know if someone's got their mic opened accidentally. If you can go ahead and just make sure that you muted yourself.
907.
Jim, I'll see if I can help with that.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. So like I say, so prior to the Amendment Act in 2008, there were other animals that were considered. People could bring in cats and things like that. So that's a key differentiation now. So if someone's bringing in a cat and they say, well, this is my service animal, that's not going to be recognized under Title II and Title III of the ADA. So that's a conversation that you would have with that individual.
Now the new narrative being.
The other thing is that we have a situation where we have what is different is an emotional support animal. What differentiates an emotional support animal from a service animal is that the emotional support animal does not have to be trained to perform a specific function for that individual. They are there simply for comfort and companionship. So those are not recognized under the ADA, but there are other laws that might apply to the services that you have that an emotional support animal could be covered. So I think I saw somebody from ODNR was participating in today. So ODNR has state parks throughout the state, and they have hotels and conference centers and things like that. You know, under housing, a emotional support animal would be allowed. So if you're looking at something in housing or some of the other things, an emotional support animal could be something that you would have to accommodate as part of that process. The other thing is when you look at an emotional support animal, it's very hard to kind of distinguish that because there are situations where somebody might have a psychiatric service animal, a dog that is trained to sense changes in someone's mood and remind them to take their medication, are examples that Department of Justice has specifically for psychiatric service animals. You know, but sometimes on the surface, looking at that, you know, there's a difference between that the person feels better, their mood improves because they have their dog with them versus the dog being trained to help remind them to go ahead and take the medication or alerting them if there's a change in their mood or something like that.
Jim, I'm going to ask you to just pause for a second. Everybody,
Sure.
please mute your, hold on one second. I think I'll be able to do this. Oh, shoot. If I mute all, it'll mute you, Jim. So I definitely don't want to do that. I'll just work through everybody's mic. I'm gonna let you go ahead and talk and find it, and I'll mute everybody but you. Thank you.
Hey, James, this is Abby. If you mute all, Jim can unmute himself.
Okay, very good.
And then that will take care of everybody who is who's unmuted and maybe stepped away.
Okay. Let me see if I can get that done. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Go ahead and continue, Jim. I'll keep working on this. I'm sorry, I lost my mute. Here we go. I'll get to it. You just go ahead and continue.
Okay, I'll keep an eye on my microphone and just make sure that it's still active. Okay, all right. So emotional service animals or emotional support animals are a little different than service animals. One of the things I kind of wanted to have some discussion about is who actually uses service animals. So you can kind of see on this slide, you know, there's different reasons somebody might use a service animal. And like I said, I want to make this as interactive as possible. So the first category we have is visual. There you go. I muted myself. So the first one we had was visual impairments. If people want to go ahead and kind of unmute your mic, and if you want to kind of put out, you know, your ideas, what somebody might with a visual impairment might use the service animal for. Like I say, this is kind of the easiest one to start with. So anybody have any thoughts on visual impairments, how a service animal might be used?
To move around, safety, to do chores, in that method.
Okay, sure. Yeah, moving around is the most common one. Seeing eye dogs have been around. They kind of started the service animals. Originally were mostly seeing eye dogs. Some of the other example of someone who has a physical impairment, what functions do you think that a service animal could do for somebody who has a physical impairment?
Retrieve medications.
Sure, going and getting stuff for someone. Picking stuff up is a very common one. You know, if someone drops something, if they have a mobility impairment, they may have an unstable gait or not be able to bend down and pick it up themselves. So that would be a great example of a physical impairment. Anything else?
Helping and dressing somebody?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Any other thoughts? Some of the other ones.
Safety, getting them away from a dangerous situation.
Sure, absolutely. Alerting someone to a dangerous situation. We could even put that in the visual impairments category as well. Some of the other things I've seen is I've actually seen where someone will attach their harness to their wheelchair and the dog will help pull the wheelchair. You know, maybe the person doesn't have enough strength to do it themselves. They can wheel along okay, but the service animal just kind of gives them that little extra power that helps them not get so tired. So that would be an example of a physical impairment there. Any other thoughts that people have? Okay. All right. The next thing, looking at sensory impairments, different than visual impairments, people who are deaf and hard of hearing have a use for service animals. What do you think that people who are deaf or hard of hearing might use a service animal for?
To warn them of someone approaching?
Very good. That was one that I was hoping that somebody would get. So yeah, letting someone know if someone's coming up, that's a safety issue, a concern for a lot of folks who are deaf and hard of hearing. So that's an excellent one. All right. We have people use service animals for people with intellectual disabilities. So somebody who has a cognitive disability, what do you think that a service animal could be trained to do to help somebody with a cognitive disability?
Possible animal to calm anxieties?
That's a potential. We're kind of cross that. That's a good answer. It potentially crosses in the emotional support. If the animal is doing something to calm the anxiety, absolutely. And an example of that. So this is a good example because it kind of gives us an opportunity to kind of talk about it. But you know, if the animal is just there and someone's petting it and it calms their anxiety, that would be an emotional support animal. But a lot of times, what animal service dogs will be trained to do is if someone gets anxious, they're starting to pace around or they're starting to fidget or something like that, the service animal can be trained to recognize those signs in that individual. And what they will do is sometimes they'll go up and they'll actually butt up against the person or nuzzle the person or something like that. So that's where we get that they're trained to help that person. So absolutely, that's a great example of a potential there. Anything else? All right. Some of the other things
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. I'd much rather you guys.
I was going to say. I was going to say they can also be more of an alert system to keep an eye on the child or the person and alert others if that person is in danger or doing something.
Sure. I mean, yeah, some sort of a response to a situation. Absolutely. That's a good one. Anybody else have any other thoughts? Okay. You know, we've had there are some examples where service animals have been trained to help someone remember to take medication and things like that as well. So it's going back to that. What were they trained to do? So that would be somebody who might have a cognitive disability who may forget to take their medication. That the service animal is kind of trained. It's like, okay, at this certain point of time, these things are supposed to happen, and if it doesn't, then they can kind of provide some sort of a reminder to that. Next one is psychological impairments. Any thoughts on what service animals can do as far as that?
Create a touch pattern for when somebody has a higher anxiety level, create a blocking mechanism to keep people at a distance, such like that.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, maintaining some, I mean, having like a personal space area, the animal could be trained to say, okay, when someone's exhibiting signs of anxiety or something like that, get between them and somebody else as part, so that the person can kind of get their bearings back in place. Absolutely.
Wake up from night terrors.
Yep. I mean, that could be. I mean, that would be a good one. They could be trained to do certain things. So, if someone's having a night terror or something like that, similar to some of the other reasons, it's like the dog could come up to them and actually snuggle close to them, and just that physical contact can kind of help reassure someone. So there again, the animal is trained to recognize a set of symptoms or scenario and then do something based on that. So they see the person having distress, they go up and they snuggle next to it, have that body contact with that person, can help that person kind of resolve their issue. So absolutely. Next condition we have down there is neurological disorders and endocrine disorders, and I'm going to kind of lump those two together. But what functions could a service animal provide to someone with that level, with that type of an impairment? Typically, for the neurological one, they tend to call these seizure response service animals. So it's kind of the same thing that we just talked about. If someone is having a seizure, then the dog can be trained to recognize that and then get close to the person, have that physical contact with that person, kind of help them from injuring themselves, banging their head or something like that. So the dog can kind of act as like a barrier. They're trained to get next to that person and act as a barrier. There have been some cases where people have maintained that their service animal can tell the oncoming of a seizure. There's a chemical change. A lot of times if someone has a seizure disorder, they might say that they see an aura before they have a seizure. The dog is trained to notice that kind of a change in that individual and can actually even alert someone to an upcoming seizure. So that's a response, a trigger and a response that they have. Same thing with the endocrine disorder. Service animals have been trained to help people with diabetes manage their blood sugars. If someone's blood sugar goes too low or too high, there's a different scent or something that the animal is trained to recognize and can alert the person so that they know to go and test. Or somebody had mentioned before, somebody else, if it's a child. I have a nephew, he's 13 now, but he's been diabetic, type 1 diabetic, since he was 18 months old. And that was one of the things that his family considered, was getting a service animal to help kind of monitor his blood sugar. I have another cousin. Diabetes runs pretty rampant in our family. I have a cousin who does have a service animal for the purpose of monitoring his blood sugar. So those are all kind of things. So what really want to kind of emphasize and focus here is any type of impairment that somebody might have, as long as the animal is trained to recognize a set of triggers or and respond to them, we have the potential for a service animal. All right, so we kind of just went through this next slide here, talking about the different kind of tasks that a service animal can provide. So guiding someone's path of travel, the seeing eye. Now I know that I want to go back just for a second. I know that we kind of talked about the American with Disabilities Amendment Act changed the definition of a service animal to a dog. There is still a provision within the ADAA, the Amendment Act, that still does allow for a miniature horse to be a service animal for the purpose of mobility. You know, someone needs to lean on their service animal to navigate or get around and things like that, or provide them with stability. There's some exception language in there for miniature horses. Now, the question that tends to come up is, what exactly is a miniature horse? That doesn't mean that it's a pony that somebody's using as a service animal. The miniature horse is actually a distinct breed of horses. They tend to stand about 36 inches, about 3 feet tall, a little bit shorter, actually quite a bit shorter than a pony. But the benefit that they do have over a dog is that they have a broader base and can actually offer some more stability. So if you were leaning against a dog, depending on what size your dog is, you know, that may be more. If you're leaning against a smaller horse, that gives you a little bit more stability as far as gait and things like that. Some of the things that service animals can provide is what they term as nonviolent protection. So when we were talking about the animals getting next to the individual, having that body contact, if someone's having a seizure, or if they were having an anxiety attack, the dog coming up to them and having that body contact, that would be nonviolent protection from them either injuring themselves or having a sense of protection. But one of the things that a service animal cannot be trained to do is that service animals are not guard dogs. So, you know, if somebody has a guard dog, or that's the function that they say, well, it's a protection animal, you know, you might have to clarify, well, what do you mean by protection? If it's just physical protection of that individual, that's not going to be covered, but some of those other things could be. We talked about the hearing loss, picking up the items, pulling the wheelchair, and then calming the individual. You know, as I was kind of researching that, some of the new things that we're using service animals for, because James is always right, is that this is constantly evolving, and we're getting new guidance out on different aspects of the ADA as we come across new situations. There was an article that I read that was talking about soldiers who were coming back with PTSD and using service animals in conjunction with them. And we'll kind of talk about that in some of the examples that we had. So it's just interesting to see how things are evolving always. Next, talking about the psychiatric. Yep.
I'm sorry, excuse me for a moment. I believe I have made you a presenter now. So yeah, you can see if that will work for you. I think I was able to do that.
Yeah, it did pop up there. So let me go ahead. I'll put up the slides here. And just working on getting caught up to where we were. Okay, so psychiatric service animals, we're going to talk about that. Just in recognizing that there is a distinct difference between that. Psychiatric service animals are individually trained to provide a service or a function for the person with disability, and the emotional support animals are just there for simple comfort of the individual. So a lot of times it's not clear whether someone is bringing a service animal in. I've seen people go into stores, people love their pets. They go into the store and they bring their dog with them. Is it a pet or is it a service animal? How do you figure that out? You are allowed to ask limited questions for that. You can ask, is this a service animal? And you can also ask what kind of tasks that the animal has been trained to do. So if someone's able to answer those two questions, then you pretty much have to accept the fact that that is a service animal. Now, there is a potential for abuse in that. People can say, I have this disability. The service animal does this for me. You'll never know whether that's true or not. But for the most part, I think that most people are honest and, they're not trying to get away with something. So if they say that, this is my mobility animal, kind of going back to looking at the animal, does that animal really look like it can provide some mobility support? So if we look at that first slide where we had the picture of the purse dog, I like to call it the purse dog that is sitting in the lady's purse, I would kind of have a hard time believing that they're using that as a mobility animal because it's really not able to guide them. It's not going to be able to provide them with mobility support as far as stability or gait control. But, you'd have to kind of listen to the person's explanation and see whether that makes sense or not, if it's reasonable or not. Questions on how do you know if it's a service animal? One of the things, some of the things you cannot ask about a service animal is you can't ask any questions about the person's disability. As a Title II entity, we aren't able to ask those kind of questions. Now, if we're talking Title I where it's employment, then somebody needs to go through a reasonable accommodation request. You do have certain rights to request documentation of the disability. Is the request reasonable and things like that. So you can use some information for Title I. But as far as Title II public services and Title III public accommodations, if you can't ask any questions about the disability, whether it's actually apparent, it could be an invisible disability. The other thing is you can't require medical documentation from the individual saying that they do have a disability or proving that they have a disability that they need the service animal for. And the other thing is specific identification cards or training certificates for service animals. There is a requirement in the ADA that says that the animal has to be trained. And there are a number of professional training agencies that go out and actually do train service animals. It's quite a lengthy process. It's an expensive process for someone to get a service animal that's trained by someone. But individuals do have the right as well to actually train their own service animal. So, I've worked with several people who have had service animal. The one gentleman I worked with, he was training his own, and that is perfectly acceptable within the standards of the law. So they don't have to be trained by a professional person. So you can't ask for a certificate. I know that there's a number of groups out there that will sell people these little identification cards saying that this is my service animal. Sometimes that's more for the individual's convenience so that they have something, but it's not something that we can require them to produce. The other thing is that available out there is those little service dog vests. You can kind of see that up there in the corner. That's also not required for it to be a service animal. There are some requirements that service animals have to be under the control of the individual, except for when they're actually performing the functions that they're required for. So a lot of times you'll see a service animal with a kind of a handle that's up by the collar, especially for people who are using it for mobility. They will actually be able to grab a hold of that handle and actually walk along with the service animal. But that's not that collar or that is not always required as long as it's under the control. So most of the time it would have to be on some sort of a leash and within the range of the scope of the individual with the disability. So now that you've kind of figured out that the person does have a disability and they are entitled to their service animal, what do we have to do as a public entity to kind of accommodate that individual? The biggest time or the biggest situation that tends to get entities or organizations in trouble is when they start to try to exclude service animals from different things. Typically, the Department of Justice guidance is that anytime that a person is allowed to do something, then with some few rare exceptions, a service animal needs to be allowed to do the same thing. So, you know, what you could do is if the service animal is not under the owner's control, you could ask the owner to remove the service animal. And we have some examples in our scenarios in the breakup session of what that might look like, or a question in regard to that. The other thing is that the animal has to be housebroken. Public and private accommodations are not required to care or supervise the animals, and that includes such things as taking it out to toilet. Now, depending on what kind of service you're offering, you might have to make some accommodations to allow people to have time to go out and do that. So if this was a Title I situation where an employee is requested to bring a service animal into the work site, you might have to make some accommodations so that they can go out and take their service animal out to relieve itself at different times. So that might require you to alter a work schedule so that they can take a break when they need to do that, or scheduling their breaks throughout the day that allows them to do that. Now, businesses can require people to clean up after their service animal. So, you know, if the dog goes out and does its business, you know, someone needs to be able to pick that up and manage that, just as if they were going out and walking the dog, you know, people carry the little plastic bags with them, clean up after their dog's mess. That's an expectation too. But also making sure that you can designate an area for the service animal to go out. Most office places, you know, there's a little bit of grass around someplace that somebody could go out and take their animal out to relieve itself. But, you know, if not, you could kind of work with that individual to figure out, you know, where they would go ahead and take the animal to do that. And then making sure that it is getting cleaned up as well. It's not a requirement for a public 2 entity to go out and actually take the dog out. So if somebody comes in for a public meeting or training with your agency and they have a service animal, you know, it would not be a reasonable expectation for that person to say, hey, can you go take my service animal out? It needs to go out to the restroom. Someone needs to be able to manage their service animal completely. And when someone gets a service animal, there's an extensive amount of training that's involved with that. Typically, they'll go down there, they'll meet their service animal a couple times during the training process. Then they will spend like a week or 2 with the service animal while they're still at the training facility so that everything is taken care of. People are very protective of their service animals. You know, if it's someone unfortunately, it does happen. If someone mistreats or is not able to care for their service animal, you know, that might impact their ability to get another service animal in the future from an agency. So a lot of times folks are very cautious and very concerned about their animal. Besides that, I mean, folks want to take care of the animal itself as well. We kind of talked about it. The rule of thumb is if a person is allowed to go there, then the service animal has to be allowed to as well, unless there's a bona fide reason for that. I didn't see anybody here that was from a medical facility. I know there's some folks from the Department of Medicaid, but that's not like a hospital or something like that. But there are some reasons you could exclude a service animal. If you had a sterile environment or a highly infectious area that you have patients in or something like that, then you can exclude a service animal. We're going to talk about some legal cases where, you know, a hospital did find a reason why they were excluding a service animal from the hospital facility. I think it's important to say that in any situation that you're looking at not allowing a service animal to go, that you look at it and fully evaluate it as to see, you know, is there anything that we can do to make it safe? Is there anything that we can do to make it sterile and things like that? But also taking a look at that, if for some reason there is a legitimate bona fide reason that the service animal cannot go there, how are you going to accommodate that individual? If you're taking that person's accommodation away, then as a public entity, we need to kind of figure out how can we provide some other sort of accommodation to this individual that would allow them to participate in the goods and services that we're providing as a public entity without that service animal. So it's not a situation where you can just say, sorry, your service animal can't come in because of this reason, and you're going to have to figure it out yourself. It's okay, you know, we can't allow your service animal in here for this reason. We looked at some options to accommodate that or mitigate the circumstance that it doesn't allow the service animal to come in, but we haven't come up with a solution. So we can't allow the service animal in, but instead we're going to provide this other accommodation that's just as effective for you so that you can still participate in what you came in there. Service animals in the workplace. I know that this can be a very touchy subject for folks. There's considerations dealing with confidentialities. You know, someone sees someone bring in a service animal. It may not always be evidently clear why that person has a service animal. So it could be an invisible disability. You know, if it's a psychiatric impairment or if it's a cognitive impairment or seizure disorder or something like that, you're not going to be able to look at that person and say, oh, yeah, that person has a disability. So a lot of times people get kind of jealous. You know, sometimes people will say, well, if he's allowed to bring his dog into work, you know, I want to bring my dog in too. So how do you address those situations? I mean, how do you talk to other employees about that? Keeping in mind that you have an obligation to protect the confidentiality of the person who has the accommodation. Question came in, and I'm trying to see if questions come in because I do appreciate questions because I want to make sure that I'm giving you what you need or want to. Can service animals have or wear personal protection to meet a sterile environment? Absolutely. That would be one of the considerations to looking at. You know, in a hospital setting, you know how those doctors have those little slip-on booties that they put over their street shoes. You know, maybe if that's your concern or the issue with that, you know, slide some of those over the dog's paws and then they can walk. You know, there's a lot of different things that you probably should look at before you're excluding. So if you have some of those options available to you, that's a great thing to look at. And being very clear with the person, because sometimes the person might be able to tell you, it's like, you know, if that's your concern, why don't we try this? Because people with service animals have had experiences before, and typically they can say, well, and yeah, this happened once before, and this is what we did to accommodate that, and it seemed to work out really well. Or you might suggest something to them, and they say, oh yeah, we tried that once before, it didn't work out, and this is the reason that it was. So absolutely, that's a great question. Some of the other things as far as looking at service animals in the workplace is it would be a reasonable accommodation to allow someone leave to go to the training with the service animal. So we kind of talked about, as someone is going and getting a service animal, especially if it's through a professional agency, they will go several times during that training process. And it is a rather long and extensive training process that they have for service animals. So they will go and meet with that service animal to make sure that they're bonded with that animal. And then they will spend a week or two with that service animal while it's still in the training facility to make sure that there's an adjustment between both the individual and the animal itself to make sure that that's a good match for that. So if somebody comes to you and says, as an employer, I'm getting a service animal, I need to take off 2 weeks to go to the facility so that I can get trained with that. That potentially is a reasonable accommodation request, and leave could be something that you would be required to provide someone for that, to do that. The other thing is workplace education. Like I say, a lot of times people will see somebody bringing in their dog to work, and they say, well, if Jim can bring in his dog, then I want to bring in my dog. It's important to explain to people without disclosing the individual's disability is that is a working animal. It's providing a function for that individual. So it's not a pet. We kind of talked about the care of the service animals, making sure that there's a place that the dog can go out and relieve itself. Some of the other things that you might need to consider is allowing the person to have a small dish of water and some dog food there at their desk so that the animal can eat during the day. If you've never been around a service animal, like I said, I've worked with several people. The guy in the office next to me had a service dog. I mean, service dogs are very calm. When he was not, that individual was blind. When he was not relying on his dog to help guide him in the hallway, that dog just laid underneath his desk as calm as you could be. And, when he started to move or started to stand up, then the dog would kind of jump up. The dogs are extremely well trained for that. So that's important to know. Some of the other things that people will say, well, I'm deathly allergic to dog dander, fear of dogs, and things like that. One of the things we kind of looking at, the Department of Justice defined a service animal as a dog as far as Title II and Title III. But EEOC has never actually defined what a service animal is. So there is a potential for different things in there. There again, it's going back to, what is this individual asking the accommodation for? And then what function would this the service animal there? Typically, it's going to be a dog. You don't see too many things outside of the dog nowadays. There are some exceptions. One of the other exceptions, and this underlies all titles of the ADA, is if there's a immediate concern for the health and safety of others that can be accommodated or a modified policy or practice. Anybody have any thoughts what a direct threat exception might look like for your agency? Okay. We'll maybe come back to this after our questions because there's a question in the breakout session that kind of addresses that. All right, so we're actually at that point in time. So what's going to happen is I emailed out a series of questions. I think there's 9 scenarios of what a service animal questions or a scenario about a service animal. If you can go ahead and take a look at those. Each of you should have been assigned a breakout session. So what you'll need to do is go ahead and open that new session up. It will put this one on hold. So you can go ahead and participate in that small group discussion with some other folks. There's about 9 people in each group. We're going to take about 20 minutes to go ahead and discuss those scenarios. And then we're going to get back together and kind of talk about what people talked about as far as, what they were asking, what they were considering. But one of the things that I would also ask you to do is not only is there some challenges with determining whether a service animal, what is a service animal and what function it is, but having that conversation with an individual about what is a service animal. So if you had a situation where, you know, somebody brought an animal into your business or the office, and you determine that it doesn't meet the definition of a service animal, maybe it's an emotional support animal. What kind of a conversation would you have with that person to say, okay, you know, this is not a service animal under the definition of the ADA? How would you have that conversation with that person? I think that when it comes to the ADA, nobody knows everything, but a lot of times when we have these training sessions, it's an opportunity for you to learn from other participants in the session itself. Just on the comments that some of the folks were making earlier, it really appears that some of you really know quite a bit about service animals. You were asking the right questions even before we got to those slides. So I would be anxious or kind of looking at, you know, what you have as far as thoughts for that. Okay. I'm got a couple people that are asking some questions. Somebody asked, they didn't see where they could join a breakout session. There should have been a separate email. There was an invitation to the overall session itself, and then there would have been a second invitation to a breakout session. If you didn't get that invitation to the breakout session, I'm going to go ahead and I'll try to get that and forward it to you. So if you just, okay. All right, somebody said they got it. Okay, so Michelle and Kendra, I'll go ahead and see if I can find your invitation for that, and I'll go ahead and send that. Like I said, we're going to do that for about 20 minutes, so it's 2:20 right now. Let's plan on getting back together at 2:40. So if you finish with your questions a little early, you can go ahead and take a break to do that. I'm going to try to jump in and out of each of the breakout sessions just so I can kind of hear what some of the conversations are going. But if you need assistance, I'll go ahead and get that information for you. So just give me a second. I got to go log into my email. All right, if you do have the email for your second session, go ahead and join that meeting now. Like say the scenarios themselves were emailed out with the power presentation at the beginning. So everybody should have that. If you go ahead and start the second session, it should place the first one on hold. And when the 20 minutes are done, when we get back at 2:40, if you go ahead and just resume this session and close out of the breakout session, but you shouldn't have to close out of this one. It'll take you and put this one on hold. Yeah, I'm going to forward the invitation to the breakout session to the couple of folks that have said they didn't get it. Okay, so Maria, Kendra, and Michelle, I just went ahead and sent you a link to a breakout session, and I also attached a copy of the questions onto that, so you have everything that everybody else should have. Thank you, Jennifer. I had to just scroll down there, so I appreciate that. The question is, there's no leaders for the breakout sessions. That's just a group discussion. I am going to jump in and try to participate in each of the calls. So I'm going to start to go into some of the other breakout sessions as well. All right, so hopefully everybody's kind of making their way back into the main session itself. So we're going to go through some of this. I was able to bounce between some of the breakout sessions, and I do appreciate everybody's flexibility. This is a new way. This is kind of the first time I've ever done a training this way. I do tend to like to be in front of the people, so I can see people and interact a little bit more. But there was some great discussion going on amongst the individual groups about some things. One of the groups actually had the great ideas. They started from the back one, the last one, and did that first and kind of worked their way. So I'm just going to go through the scenarios one at a time, and we'll kind of see if anybody wants to kind of chime in. I might call out a specific group to if they had a point. So the first scenario was that the individual walks in the office building with a dog. The dog is wearing a red service animal vest. Dog is walking 5 feet in front of the person and does not have a leash. When asked, the person states that it's a mobility service animal. What were people's thoughts on this? What would you think if you came across this situation?
Okay, I'm going to jump in. A service dog does not have to be leashed as long as the leash is prohibitive of servicing that person with the disability. But most times the service dog is leashed.
Right, absolutely. The Department of Justice guidance is that it should be under the control of the individual who's using the service animal, and most of the time it will be some sort of a harness or a leash, unless of the dog has to function there. And when I was talking earlier in the session, one of the things that when I was kind of doing some updated research on and learning a little bit more about this, there's a new use for service animals for veterans who are coming back with PTSD. And one of the specific examples the Department of Justice had in there is that they had a service dog where it was trained to go into the building and then come out, and it was kind of a reassurance to the veteran that it was safe for them to go in. So that was the function the service animal was trained to do, and that animal would not be on a leash because that would interfere with their ability to do that kind of a task. So that's the key point that you need to consider is what task is it doing, and can it do that task if it's has a leash or a handle on it. So that was a great answer. The next scenario was an individual is participating in a public meeting for an administrative rule change and has a service animal. The person is sitting at the end of the main aisle. The person has a red and white folding cane in their lap. People walk up and down the aisle to get to the microphone. Each time someone walks by, the dog growls at them. How would you? What were your thoughts on this one, or how would you address this one?
In group number 1, we discussed, Maria mentioned that we could ask the employee to move to the other side of the aisle, possibly away from the people that the dog is growling at. Stephanie indicated that we should not ask this person how the animal assists, but we can ask, is there a better place to sit the animal, or a better place to sit for the person where that wouldn't upset the animal? If the disturbance continues, the person can stay, but the animal must leave if it's disruptive or dangerous.
Okay. Does anybody else have any thoughts on this one?
The growling creates a little bit of a threat scenario. The dog should not be growling whatsoever.
Okay. All right. So this one's a little bit different, and this is one that in these scenarios, I'm not sure that there's always a right or wrong answer to this. It's just a way of different of looking at it. So one of the things I would probably look, rather than asking the individual to move, I would probably see, could we relocate the podium someplace else or something like that? The person with the disability differently, because we wouldn't ask anybody else to move. We just have to do that. So somebody might take offense to that and say, okay, you're asking me to move because I have a service animal, and that could be a potential issue. The other thing I think one of the things is looking at this, and I purposely made some of these vague because when we have ADA issues with service animals, they're never very clear. It's very seldom a black or white, yes or no answer to that. When you're looking at this one, looking at, is the function that the dog is trained to do, is it trained to growl when someone walks by or up to the person? Purpose put in there that they had the red and white cane so that we would know that this person was a person with a visual impairment. So if this person is blind, and if someone is coming close or walking in that person's space, is the dog trained to growl? Not necessarily a threatening growl, but is it trained to growl to alert the person that somebody is approaching them or close to them and things like that? So a lot of times it would be, you would have more information when you go into these scenarios. But these were kind of created to maybe give us different ways of looking at, or different ways of thinking of situations. So like I say, there's not really right or wrong answers to this, but that was just an example I wanted to have for that. The next one was an example of an new employee comes in with a reasonable accommodation. It's all documented in HR. Another employee kind of comes up to you and says, "Hey, I see Faith's bringing in her dog to work." A lot of times people just assume that people and their pets, they can't be separated. Faith is my daughter's name, and she does have a dog, and she doesn't go anywhere without it. So she's kind of like that. In this situation, the other employee says, "Hey, I'm allergic to dog dander." So allergies and fear of dogs come up a lot in reasonable accommodation or service animal cases. In this case, it's very specific that you should talk about, that this is that the dog is performing a work function. It's assisting Faith when they're working, and that's what you can kind of say in that regard without disclosing anything. But you might have a obligation to accommodate two employees in this case. So the first person for the service animals made their reasonable accommodation request to HR, but if someone is allergic to dog dander and things like that, you might have to maybe relocate one of the employees to an area that the dog is not in. So just looking at, in this case scenario, you actually have a responsibility for two potential accommodations in there, and that's kind of what we want to show. But just because someone has a fear of dogs or is allergic to dog would not be a reason to deny the person who needs the service animal as the accommodation as well. We may not get through all of these. The last group, had a really good conversation about the one with the dog barking in the glass window. So I want to go to that one and let them kind of talk about what they were talking about so that they can kind of share that. This is number 7. Talking about a training, and the person has a service animal. The service animal gets up and goes over to the window, sees his reflection in the glass panel and starts barking, and it's disrupting the training itself. So if someone from that last group wants to kind of talk about what you were talking about.
Okay, I'll go ahead and do it here. So basically, a dog must be under the command of the individual who has the service dog. But there are exceptions to that rule. Somebody who might be ready to have a seizure, a diabetic episode, or something to that such, that dog may be trained to bark in that situation. The other thing on that is somebody that's about ready to have an episode or like that, or maybe in the middle of one. If you ever have a service dog approach you, coming up, trying to get your attention and bring you somewhere, those dogs are actually trained to bring assistance to somebody who may be needing it.
Right. So, I mean, they had that unique perspective that I really like to see, is that they were saying, okay, we're looking at what the dog's doing itself, but they also kind of came back and focused, what's going on with the owner of the service animal itself. It's like, is that person okay? Is that person safe? So that was a very good perspective that I wanted to kind of share. Let's see if we have time for maybe another one here. Just 5 and 6 are kind of similar to them, so I'll go over those rather quickly. Healthcare facility and food services. We talked a little bit about that, but generally, if a person is allowed in one of those areas, then a service animal has to be allowed as well. Sometimes if there's a service animal in a food service area or a healthcare facility, somebody might say, well, that's unsanitary, or that's not clean, or that's a violation of the health code regulations or something like that. The ADA does kind of supersede some of that. So the health department regulations itself, not having an animal in a food service prep area, service animal kind of takes priority because that's federal law. So that's not an issue. Same thing with the patient care, as long as that you can make accommodation, and somebody had made the suggestion of using the PPE for a service animal, whether it's those little booties or a mask or something like that, that you could put on the service animal that would accommodate, or maybe even a hospital gown to kind of cut down on the dander. Those are all things that people should kind of consider as accommodations for the service animal as well. Before saying that we're going to go ahead and exclude that service animal from that. And then the last one we'll kind of look at is number 9. And that one was pretty clear as well. In this case, the person saying that, it's a guard dog and it makes me feel safe. That might be something that would be considered an emotional support animal, and that's talking about the feeling safe, the feeling of comfort. But it's not actually trained to perform a function for that individual with a disability. So in that case, it would not be considered a service animal, but could be considered an emotional support animal, and maybe allowed under some of the other rules, but it would not be allowed under Title II or Title III of the ADA. I'm going to go through there. There's just some of the other discussion that went on that I thought was really good. And we're going to kind of hit that now, is service animal etiquette. It's important for coworkers and people in the public settings to understand that service animals are not pets. Service animals are trained to recognize and respond to issues going on with their owners. And a lot of times they're referred to as a working dog. Now, one of the groups, I can't remember which one it was talking about, there was a public service announcement that, a person was in a wheelchair and somebody came over and asked them to pet their wheelchair. And they said, well, you don't pet a wheelchair. And then they changed, the same PSA had a situation where they had a service dog and somebody's coming over and asking to pet the service dog. And we really need to train coworkers and things like that service animals, you shouldn't be asking people to pet someone's service animal. Sometimes what I've seen is, especially, in some of the public settings, where people will try to kind of call the dog over so they can pet it. And it's like, then when you do that, that distracts the animal from performing the function that it was intended to do, or it may take that animal away from the person when they might need them. So if you are inclined to pet an animal, like I said, I worked next to a guy who had a service animal. The dog was in the office quite often. It's like, after a while, it's like, he goes, oh yeah, if you want to pet him, go ahead and pet him. It's like, he didn't care, but it was something that you also knew him well enough, and you knew the service animal well enough that, if he was starting to get up, you wouldn't want to prevent the dog from going to assisting him navigate through the office building. So looking at that, sometimes, I once saw some kids kind of holding out their hand like they were trying to get the dog to come over to them and get a treat. Now, service animals, like I say, are incredibly trained animals. So a lot of times they are trained and will kind of ignore those kind of activities. So if someone tries to call a service animal over, a lot of times that service animal will know better than that. And it's like, sometimes the dog knows more than the person, so that they won't go over there, and they'll still maintain their working relationship with their owner. We're kind of out of time. There's some legal cases that I just kind of put down there some things that were interested. You know, this was some example of what their disability was and what the service animal was trained to do for those people. First one was somebody with epilepsy, a seizure disorder, and a spinal cord injury, and what the animal was trained to do for them. Psychiatric impairment, and what the animal was trained to do is recognize some of the signs. The one case that I did want to look at, this one was a transportation provider refused to transport a service animal. There was this one case, this last one here, this Roe versus Providence Health System. When we kind of talked about that, there are legitimate reasons why to exclude a service animal, but we always have to look at what other kind of accommodations we can make for that person. In this case, there was a size in the grooming of the animal. The animal was not as well kept up as it could have been or should have been, whether that was because of the limitations of the person's disabilities. You know, the person had some significant health issues. They were actually in the hospital themselves, so they were having trouble maintaining their own health. So they may not have been taking care of their service animal very well, but it smelled and it was dirty. Was grooming. You know, the hospital did try to accommodate the person before they excluded the service animal. They suggested a HEPA filter. They asked the patient to close their door. The patient didn't want to do that for whatever reason. So eventually the hospital did say, you know, we can't have your service animal here because it's causing a problem for our other patients and things like that as far as a medical facility. I do want to go back to one of the other the last scenarios, is that one of the other questions that sometimes comes up with service animals is people having multiple service animals. The ADA does permit people having multiple service animals because they can fulfill different roles. You know, one of the groups was kind of talking about that. Somebody might have, I just kind of cut part of the conversation, but if somebody might have a service animal and might have two service animals. So one might be used for mobility, getting them to ambulate and walk around, and the other one might be used for picking up small items if they have some issues with dexterity and things like that. So there's reasons why somebody could have multiple service animals. So if someone comes in with more, you couldn't exclude one of their service animals or say that they could only bring one or the other in there. I'm not going to go over the post-test questions. From what I could hear from the groups that when I was jumping in there, everybody seems to have a really good understanding of what they need to do to look at and figure out whether an animal is a service animal or not, what they can ask and what they can't ask or how they should treat that. So people did fairly well in the pretest. I'm hoping that everything, the score went up there. The question came in is to clarify, can an emotional support animal, could it be considered as a reasonable accommodation under Title I? EEOC does not define what a service animal is, I'm sorry, EEOC doesn't define that a service animal has to be a dog, but it's still, a service animal still has to be trained to provide some sort of a function for that individual. So in a case of a reasonable service animal, trained to allow someone to do an essential function of the job. So it would require some individual analysis of what somebody's asking the accommodation for. And you would have to make a decision on that. So, you know, if it's just because it makes me feel good and I'm a better employee when I feel good, that's probably not going to be covered. But if it's something that, you know, I have a lot of anxiety, I get fidgety at work and things like that. And when I get anxious, I can't focus and concentrate on my job. So in that case, the animal could be trained to provide a service or a function to that individual, and then it would fall under the reasonable accommodation. But just that simple, because the animal is there, that it's doing something for someone, that it's not performing a function, that's probably not going to be considered a reasonable accommodation. All right. I do appreciate, we are at the end of the session. I do appreciate everybody's time. Like I say, you had a lot of great discussion. I appreciated the opportunity to kind of come and talk to you about service animals today. I'm going to turn it back over. I don't know as far as you going to your next session, what you have scheduled for the rest of the day, but I hope everybody has a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Jim. Excellent job. Good information. And I'm glad you addressed that question about emotional support animals. So you still have to go through your process and determine if you could offer that as a reasonable accommodation. So excellent. Thank you for that information. I just want to remind you to do the evaluations that's posted in this chat. And if you're going to continue with us, we will be doing another session shortly about one of the databases that we're going to use for the RA process. So with that being said, thank you very much. We'll hopefully see you in the next session. Have a good one.